Welcome to our panel discussion. Our premise today is that network automation isn't just about configuring network devices. And in fact, it could be argued that device configuration is incidental to what network automation is really all about. That might be my opinion, and I don't want to speak for our fine panelists. I am Ethan Banks, your moderator. You likely know me as a recovering CCIE and host of the Heavy Networking and Enter for Networking podcast on the Packet Pushers Podcast Network. Justin Ryburn. Justin, raise your hand. Justin is the field CTO at network intelligence company Kentic. Chris Wade. Chris, raise your hand. Chief Technology Officer and co-founder of Itential, where he leads the company's technology strategy and product innovation. And you might have been expecting Chris Beavers if you were looking at your notes, but he had life intrude at the very last minute, was not able to make it to Nanog. So Bill Latrevic has ably stepped in for Chris. Bill is the co-founder and chief revenue officer at Netbox Labs. Okay, guys, our panel is entitled Network Automation, not just about configuring network devices. Okay, what is network automation about? Chris Wade, kick us off.
All right, so we've been talking about configuring devices for a long time, watching Nanog presentations on NetConf, GNMI, all these types of technologies. In the hallway track, we've really talked about how we integrate systems together. And automation is I spent a lot of time talking about automation and orchestration and how we automate tasks and tie them together with orchestration. So I think automation started as pushing configs, then it increased to integrating systems together, and now we're talking about how we tie systems together for larger outcomes.
Justin?
Yeah, I got to echo a lot of what Chris said. We've been writing Perl scripts to do, minor configuration changes back from when I ran it.
Just dated yourself.
I did date myself. For anyone who's not familiar with that, that was a programming language that existed before Go. So, but yeah, to Chris's point, we've been doing small minor changes. Maybe it was changing an SNMP community in a configuration on a device or updating an access list on a router and wanting to automate that task, for lack of a better term, across all the devices on the network, right? Instead of having to log into each one and do it manually. We were doing this back in the late 90s when I ran a network. So.
Change the NTP server on all of them.
Yeah, on all of them, yeah. I think, to Chris's point, it's kind of scaled out since then, right? If you think about a network that's operating at the scale the previous presenter was just showing, where you've got, thousands and thousands and thousands of devices in these fabrics, you can't log into those and manually configure them, right? You've got to automate that, and you've got to have a good system in place, to Chris's point, to be able to do that automation, right? It's not just about point scripts. It's about really thinking holistically about the system and what you're trying to accomplish.
Bill, you want to add?
Sure. I really like the idea of thinking holistically about the network as a system. I think when you are looking at just configuring devices, that's good for getting things done, maybe moving a little bit more quickly. But I think the network is becoming a competitive advantage for most enterprises in these days. And speed is of the essence, and understanding how each device actually fits in the grander context, what services, what business drivers are being affected every time a device is either configured correctly or misconfigured. So automation becomes the way that you gain that control over all these disparate devices in your network. And start to provide a competitive advantage to your enterprise.
Okay, you guys said holistic, you said system, but yet network engineering for a lot of years has been device by device. We go into a device, we configure it to do the thing. The systems thinking that might happen happens in our heads as a network engineer. That is, we know we have to configure these 6 or 10 or whatever devices to accomplish some task or to deliver some service. And we understand that as engineers, how to deliver that, but we still do it device by device. So how do we change our thinking so that we're using automation platforms to deliver a service? Yeah, there's still individual device configurations that are going to happen, but we're doing that holistic delivery of those configurations. Something's got to change, right?
Maybe I challenge your assumption slightly, Ethan. There are systems, like, if you think of like a data center fabric orchestration that some of the vendors offer, right, where they think of like an entire data center, or at least an entire rack, as a system, and they They view that as a system that works well together and is orchestrated by a controller and so forth. So we have seen examples, I think, as an industry of that. But I get your point that as a, in a broader sense, we still tend to think of individual devices, at coming together and built together by the network engineer as a system. But I think it's a mind shift. I think we need to view the entire end-to-end network as part of the system that's delivering the experience, whether that's applications, users, content, whatever it may be, right?
What does that mean for our automation systems, though? Is there something, like we were talking in the beginning about automation initially was a script and we just run it 100 times across 100 different devices to accomplish the same task repeatedly. We're not talking about that at this point. How would you describe it?
I mean, I've never been a big fan of like distributed control planes and building an entire, let's say an entire nationwide network where you have a single control plane. I think your failure domain is way too large for that. So I still think we want our devices, at least this has always been my experience, you want your devices to each think for themselves, right? To have their own individual control planes. You want them orchestrated through routing protocols and stuff, but having them all operate as one, I don't know, I think is a bad idea. That doesn't mean you can't do configuration, automation as a holistic thing and view your entire network as a system and orchestrate things like that.
Chris?
Yeah, I might take us in a different direction in the sense that, I think most people in the room have spent significant time automating and orchestrating services. A lot of data models involved, and we've really been adopting infrastructure as code over the last couple of years to tie a lot of these systems together. And I think, there's been a lot of AI presentations this week, maybe throw that in here in the sense that, as a software company, we're, rethinking how we build software, rethinking how we do pipelines. And, there's been a couple comments about learning from external verticals and such. So I think, we have an opportunity to kind of rethink how we build services and how we build these pipelines. With a lot of the concepts that are going on in software development today. So I think we really do have an opportunity to rethink how services are offered, what products we offer. And we have new tools at our disposal that we didn't have before. So a lot of the discussions around automation orchestration are fairly constrained by how we've been operating for the past 5 or 10 years. But I do think we have it's a pretty critical moment, in our industry to rethink kind of how we operate infrastructure larger.
I think we need to define service then, because service could mean L3 VPN, or it could mean something quite a bit smaller,
Sure.
Depending on your point of view. Bill, maybe you got a take on this. You can model services in NetBox, for example.
Sure. You can start with devices. Devices make up services. It's kind of you're going up a level of abstraction, and then maybe even another level of abstraction. A router can be part of a checkout system, for example, or it could be part of multiple systems. It could be part of the checkout system. It could be part of your web access, for example. The ability to look at things not by a device by device method, but understand what business impact these are happening. Or these are having, is very, very important, especially as you're looking to sell network automation within your own organization to show the impact that your network engineering actually has on the business. You need to start thinking in terms of the things that the executives are thinking about, like speed, like risk reduction, like rolling out new business processes faster to gain a competitive advantage. And only by looking at groups of devices as services are you really able to get to that level of understanding that an executive will resonate with.
Justin, you've got some ideas about defining a service, or give us some examples of what you think of as a network service?
Well, I think if you were to ask the business stakeholders what they define as a service, I'm not sure network service is what they actually think of. I think maybe this is the point that Bill was making, right? Is we think in terms of network service, like, are we delivering an L3 VPN? Are we delivering an EVPN, a data center fabric overlay? Like, those are the type of services we think in, because we're network nerds, right? But I think if you were to go and ask the business stakeholders when they think of service, they think again of like the applications that we're delivering to our users, the cart, the checkout, that's the way they think. And I think, kind of taking this back to network automation for a second, if we're building automation frameworks that allow the other parts of the business to sort of self-serve and build their services on top of the network without needing to understand the network and how it works and how we automate it, how we configure it, how it all comes together, that's really what the business is after, right? That's what they're trying to accomplish. I mean, if we look at the way that the hyperscalers have delivered quote unquote services to the applications teams that are delivering it, they've abstracted away the network. Now, we all know there is a network under there. There's real router switches, firewalls, cabling that exist to make all that stuff work. But to the developers who are consuming an EC2 instance and connecting it to an S3 bucket and delivering an application, they don't need to know that any of that exists, right? Because it's all abstracted and automated, for lack of a better term, for them.
So if the network engineer is delivering a network service, and are we saying that we are not configuring network devices? I mean, we are, because right,
it has to be done.
But are we supposed to be thinking at the abstracted level, or what's happening on the network devices, or both?
I would say both.
Okay.
Yeah,
Services are stacked on services, right? So you brought up the AWS example. So if you look at Agent Core running on S3 and Lambda underneath, it depends on where you are in the stack. But the one other thing I would add in the services discussion is, historically, we've thought about services as stuff we deliver on our assets. You brought up eVPN and layer 3 VPN style services. But increasingly, we just saw the presentation. We're talking about global provisioning of services. A lot of times it's on other people's stuff too, right? So, we might be delivering a service on our own infrastructure, but increasingly we're delivering services on other people's stuff, especially when you start bringing up the cloud examples.
Raise of hands. You guys that are working with network automation, are you thinking about it the way we talked earlier in the panel? I'm using a network automation to deliver the same small thing to 100 devices or 1,000 devices. That's your primary use case for automation. Got a few people like that. What about what we're talking about now, where it is more about services? You're thinking in terms of services. Raise your hand. How many of you don't use automation? So we got somebody, okay, some of that too. All right, so if my job is to deliver a network service and it's not configuring network devices, I might be configuring network devices along the way, that's part of it, right? But my primary job, the way I should be thinking about this is I'm delivering a network service. How do I get started doing that? Because I would argue a lot of network engineering shops are not set up for that way of thinking, especially not for like self-service and service catalogs, which I think Chris, you mentioned that earlier on. So how do I get started with building a network service as a way of thinking and then building a practice around that in my network operations?
I'm sure, I know you have lots of opinions on this, so I want to hear you first.
Yeah, there's some chicken and eggs involved. I think that the first thing we need to do is look at the programmability of the infrastructure. And where it doesn't exist, we use tooling and instrumentation to do so. I think that's a critical component of delivering a service if we're going to talk about automation and
programmability, as in my infrastructure can live as code, and then I can use programmability to deliver that infrastructure as code to a device?
Yeah, maybe not as code, but it needs to have the ability for a machine to interface it in some meaningful way, right? So, step number one, we'll talk about modeling and other things, I'm sure, from Bill. But I think at the end of the day, we need to understand the product that we're offering our customer. It could be internal or external. We need to understand the components of that. We need to have a data structure to support it, and we need to be able to program it at scale. And the other part I'll add that we really haven't talked about is the entire ecosystem of the customer, the product, the service, and the inventory that might be associated with that, and keeping that all in sync. Because most of these services lead to concepts of lifecycle. We start off by talking about pushing config. If it's fire and forget, then we end up understanding whether the network is in the state we want it in. So immediately when we start talking about services and tying systems together, I think you lend yourself to starting to think about the life cycle of these services, because ultimately there's a customer on the other end of that, so we can understand how we're ultimately delivering value to whoever that is, internal or external.
Now you brought up models, and
Yeah.
and Bill, let's talk about that.
Well,
Can you get into an example of maybe how we model a service, what that looks like?
yeah, so I actually wanted to just pick up on one thing that Chris was talking about, which, the planning. Planning can't start with how am I going to configure that device? Planning actually has to start at the other side, right? What is the service I'm going to bring? What is the underlying infrastructure that needs to support that service? And therefore, what devices need to be there, and how do they need to be configured?
You said start on the other side, as in talking to the consumers, the business side?
Or from the top down, right? Start at imagining what the service is rather than imagining how that device is going to be configured.
Okay.
Right, and so the plan is really important, but in order to even execute on a plan, then you actually need to know what should be, right? We talk at Netbox Labs, we talk a lot about what is and versus what should be and what the difference is there. And this all comes down to how do you model that? How do you model all these devices? How do you then consolidate it into a place where you can do the planning, where you can see the interconnectivity of all these devices, where you can understand how they have been configured or how they will be configured, and then compare it to what the actual state of play is in the actual network. Because until you're seeing what is and comparing it to what should be, your intent, then you don't know if what you've actually planned is going to be successful.
Okay, you said a lot of things there. One is the visualization of the service. So that means, going back to modeling, we need to be able to model what that service is to have that point of comparison.
For sure.
And what would that look like? Any specific examples? Am I asking an unfair question?
Well, I don't know. I think it's different for everybody, and there are lots and lots of different visualization tools out there that you can use to look at how things are interconnected. We see a lot of people looking at, for example, Netbox data, where they keep all the information that they have about the devices, the IP addresses, the interconnectivity between them, the different components of their network and how they're all interrelated. And then as they're making changes to that, they're doing that within that data model. And then they're having that sort of reviewed by various different people in the organization to make sure that they're making changes that aren't going to be breaking changes. They're making changes that are going to be the right changes for their intent. This is getting all the device information into a single system so that you have full visibility. If you have some device information in a spreadsheet and some device information in a Visio diagram and some in Infoblocks and some in some other tool, it's very, very hard to get that holistic view that you need to understand how these services all mesh together.
Okay.
I think the original question was, where do you start, right? And I think at the end there, Bill came to something that's really important. Where you get started is figuring out what you have, right? Inventorying what you have in the network. I know a lot of customers that I talk with, and I'm sure, Bill, you have the same experience at Netbox Labs. They're in a brownfield environment, right? They came in, they inherited, they may not even know, they may not have the spreadsheet, or the spreadsheet may not be up to date on like what devices do I have, what version of code are they running, what IP addresses are they, where are they physically located? Like getting all of that data collected and sort of discovering what's in the network, getting that all, to your point, in one place. So now I know what I have, physical assets I have and how they're currently configured is where you have to start, right? From there, you can start figuring out, okay, now I know what I have. I know where I want to go. I know what the services are that I want to deliver for the organization. And I can then stitch together how I get from here to there. But I find most customers that I interact with, they're stuck even just figuring out what they've got and making sure that it's up to date and organized. The documentation's up to date.
Can actually be a really challenging problem. Yeah. They're discovery tools. We have a discovery tool. No discovery tool actually discovers everything.
Nope.
Mm-hmm. We have some clients that are in OT environments too. And there are certain things in your network where if you have an operational technology environment, maybe in manufacturing or something like that, where you actually can't scan those devices, because those devices might be a chocolate extruder from 1980, right? And if you actively scan it, you're going to break it, and maybe the company that built it is not even in existence anymore, so there's no one to fix it. And in those cases, you actually have to send people out to those devices and manually figure out, not only what the serial number is on that device, but how it's configured, what the software is running on it, and then manually put that into whatever system you're using as a system of record, so that you know what's out there. And so that is a huge and daunting task, especially in a brownfield environment. It's why we see a lot of companies pick a greenfield project and start there, because then they can build sort of the collective understanding of how to go about network automation in a greenfield environment where there is no wrong answer, because everything you put out there is what you intend, right? And then you roll that slowly into the brownfield environments.
Nice when you can get it, but Chris, how many greenfield environments do you get to work with?
Not very many, but I do want to recognize, I'm sure everybody in the room is thinking through a certain amount of complexity that we're discussing. So when you say greenfield environments, I think the easiest metaphor for that is looking at provisioning some services in a cloud via Terraform CDK, your choice of tooling and infrastructure. When we start talking about automating and orchestrating the types of networks that the people in this room represent, the end-to-end service orchestration there's a certain amount of technical debt that comes across with this, independent of tools. It's usually reserved for our most critical services that we offer our customer, whatever line of business we're in. Just because of, we talk about getting the data right, getting the orchestration right, hooking the tools together. So I believe it's reserved for kind of like our most critical services. When we think about what's on the horizon with agentic and otherwise, I brought up infrastructure as code earlier. We can imagine rethinking how we run these things agentically first. And I do think it's going to scale out the types and volume of services and operations that we can deal with. So I think we know how to do this. I think most people in the room have done this to a certain degree for those critical services. Things that don't reach the business value or the ROI or the investment level, we tend to run scripts. We tend to piece together manually. But when we start thinking about scaling this out, I mean, all the discussion this week on LLMs in the data center, I'm desperate to use it for our own needs instead of everybody else. And I think there's great promise that we're going to be able to leverage this technology to simplify the active orchestration. Sometimes use the network as a certain source of truth, and to let us not just deliver services better and faster, but scale like the volume and types of things that we can deliver.
So we jumped from how we get started to agentic AI. That happened fast.
But
to your point,
sure.
we started with programmability. You brought that up. We brought up the need for discoverability, being able to discover the entirety of the network, so know what we've got. And now we're talking about, now that we know those things and we have those capabilities, we need to identify a service, have a model for what that service looks like.
Sure.
And now when we get to agentic AI, we're talking about the means by which we would deliver that service, giving us a new ability rather than running scripts. We're asking agents to deploy bits and pieces and parts of it to bring us that whole service.
For sure. And I would say that, a lot of people in discussions think of agentic as like the final step, like we automate, orchestrate agentic. If we look how it's been adopted in other industries, it's with us from the beginning. If people, if I walk around and I see ChatGPT and Claude on screens as I walk around, which is exciting. But if people are using this at the beginning of their journey, right? They might use it to write their Python script. They might have an agent that just runs 2 or 3 scripts. They might have an agent that updates ServiceNow or Slacks people while they're operating. So I think I would challenge everybody to try to adopt it early in the cycle and not necessarily a destination. And it's going to be very similar to how we adopted automation in the sense that I'm going to start with some read-only stuff. I'm going to start with diff sets. I'm going to start with human in the loop. But yeah, I think we should bring it forward and think about it from the beginning, and it helps us reimagine how we're going to do services. The most critical services, I would still argue, we're going to do how we do today. Full guardrails, full modeling, full execution. But when we talk about scaling out operations, I think we can rethink a few things, including config pushes that might not be related to those critical services.
Okay, quick interaction with all of you out here. Agentic AI, that is, if we dispatch an agent to perform some network task, from what you understand of agentic AI as a technology currently, what is your trust level? Are you comfortable presuming guardrails and so on, like Chris was just talking about, that agentic AI will A, do the thing that you want it to do and not cause you headaches, so that you want to turn this thing on to make you more efficient? Yes, I'm interested in agentic AI. I think that it's there, or it's going to be there soon. We have a few true believers, okay?
And I saw some heads like this.
And then the opposite, your opinion of AI and agentic AI and actually using it in network operations is like, no, it's immature, or I don't trust it, or I'm not sure yet, something more like that. Okay, we got about a 50-50 split, I would say, between the two. All right.
There's probably a middle ground too, right? Use agentic AI to understand your network first, right? To see what actually is out there. I mean, simple things that we see people doing are, tell me about my IP address allocation in data center A, right? Are there any overlapping IP address ranges, in these 3 locations? Simple things like that used to take a lot of time to go click around through spreadsheets or click around through databases or click around through whatever tooling you have. Like, that's a first step towards using it to increase the speed and efficiency of your network automation team. And then later, maybe we get to the point where it's actually acting on the network, it's changing things, it's driving things. And I like what Chris said, like, for the critical systems, you're still going to have a human in the loop there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you can, like, most organizations, I think, have a change control process, right? Where you're not making changes to the production network without it being either reviewed or done in a maintenance window. Like, they have processes and procedures around that they've learned from battle scars over the years on what needs to be done for their organization, right? And I kind of see agentic that way too. Like, you could have the agent generate the config that you're thinking about pushing, the change that you're thinking about making to the network, create however you do it, ServiceNow ticket, request the change window, be reviewed by someone in the organization to say, yeah, that actually passes the sniff test. That looks like a legitimate change that's going to do what we want it to do. Or no, that's absolutely crazy. There's no way we want to push that to production, schedule it in maintenance. Well, like, you can still do a lot of the processes and procedures that we know are best practices as an industry, and yet have agentic AI helping us with the config generations and some of the more manual tasks, I think.
There's a cost associated with all of this. There's a financial cost, there's a time cost, there's a operational impact, because we're changing our processes if we move in this direction and how we're leveraging network automation. I need management support for this. I might need to spend, I might need time and some flexibility and just buy-in from the business side to make this happen. How do I explain the business benefit of going this route, retooling my network operations to go in this direction?
Yeah, I don't think you do it by telling how many devices you can reconfigure. I think ultimately what we see is the most successful network automation teams, the most successful projects that we encounter, are tying what they're doing to an executive level business value, whether that's a reduction of risk, whether that's speed to deploy. I mean, especially in this world of the AI data centers that are getting deployed all the time, we hear things like, we're moving so fast that we have turbines in the parking lot because we can't get enough power to our data centers, and we need to move faster and faster. Automation is critical to that. Even just rolling out these new data centers, you can't be manually configuring all those devices. You have to have a plan, and you have to be automating it. So again, I think tying to speed or risk reduction, or even the cohesion between your audit and your compliance people, your security folks, and helping them do their jobs better by providing them access to all this information about your network. I think that's all part and parcel of getting your project funded.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, there were a couple of really great talks on this topic at the AutoCon 4 last fall that I think a lot of people in this room were at. One done by Jeff Gray and one done by Alex Hinthorn-Awane. And what I really liked about both of those talks is, to Bill's point, they were trying to get us as engineers to think in the business terms that the CXO, the CFO, who's going to greenlight these projects, are going to think, right?
Jeff got right into the weeds about how to do accounting style discussions and how to do those computations and give a believable financial report and set expectations so that folks can go, we're going to fund this because at the end of this, we should get an ROI.
Right. Here's the actual dollars and cents reason why we're going to get to your point, an ROI, return on investment, which is, I think, being a network practitioner most of my career, that's not the first thing I think about. I think about
It's the
like all
last thing I would think about.
Yeah.
It's like, this is the right thing to do.
right.
Pay
Fund
for it.
Yeah,
And-
why would we
right,
not?
right,
It
right.
makes sense, right? But if you put yourself, I think, and this was I think the point that Jeff was making in that presentation, if you put yourself in the shoes of the CEO or the CFO, whoever whoever's budget this is, what they're thinking about, they don't care about that, right? They have a business to run, they have a budget to look after. They need it presented to them in a way that they can understand what it is you're trying to accomplish in the terms that they think about it. If you can do that successfully, and I've had great leaders through my career that I've watched do this, and like to your point, I thought I presented a really great case on why we should do this because it just made sense. It's where the industry is going, and we need to be on board. And like I thought I had done a nice job of laying it out, and then I had someone else who would come in and be able to do what Jeff was describing, where they put it in a nice spreadsheet with like, okay, here's the time we're spending now, here's the time we'll save, this is what our average hourly rate is for what we're paying our engineers, and be able to present it in dollar and cents. They're like, yes, we absolutely need to do that, and it got greenlit. I was like, man.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I think we think deeply about technology. We tend to not think as deeply on the business side. So I think it depends on what we're doing. So if we're doing automation, we talked about pushing configs. It turns into kind of like how many times I do this times how long it takes type of logic. We talked about service delivery. If I have internal or external customers, it's the time to value on that service. What's the how many days do I have to wait to get it? That type of thing. When we start thinking about larger concepts that we're getting to, it's really how we transform how we operate infrastructure. And I think it's a little bit business specific and the type of network specific. But I think we can think deeply about what it means to operate infrastructure at scale more effectively. I mean, we've seen some presentations in the last day and a half where there's not a lot of people running around doing things. There's a lot of investment in automation and orchestration because it drives the business.
Yeah.
And I think understanding that impact is
okay. You said
tremendous.
transforming infrastructure. Do we speak about that to business stakeholders in terms of, look, these are things we could do if we had this infrastructure and this ability in place to automate service delivery. We do these things today, we can do it more efficiently, but in the future, we could do these other things too.
For sure. A lot of times it's about maybe us versus how we're operating infrastructure on our ultimate customers. And if we can ever tie it to the external value, I think it changes the conversation for sure. So a lot of times when it's automation and orchestration, it's a little bit more about the cost to deliver the services, the time to value on those services. But ultimately, when we transform how we operate, and there's things like self-service, or maybe I win in the market because I have self-service, or the time I can turn it around, or the previous presentation, how quickly ads come out. That's the product owners and business stakeholders are going to be very interested in that. And I think without automation and orchestration, it's very hard for us to transform how we operate, especially at the speed of technology that's happening today.
One of the things we haven't talked about yet is integrating what we are delivering as network operations with other teams that are delivering security. So SecOps teams might care about what we're doing. DevOps teams might care about what we're doing. As we move our network automation towards service delivery, holistic view, do we synchronize with those other teams? Is there a win there? You're nodding your head. You have to say words now.
I'm happy to say words. Yeah, there's a big win there because, early on, I used to hear from network automation teams that the security guys would knock on their door and say, I need to know what's in the network and how it's all interconnected. And they'd hand them a big spreadsheet, and the security guys would have to go off and spend countless hours trying to figure out from an Excel spreadsheet what was connected to what, right? Because that's really what they want to know is if something happens to this, what's the risk for the rest of the business? And what's the risk for the rest of the network? And so we call it cohesion, right? Once you've gotten coverage, you understand what's in your network, and then you have confidence in that data that what is what should be. Now you want to share that information with, again, security teams or compliance teams or audit teams or financial teams or the ServiceNow team as an example, right? Because they're the ones that are doing all the ITSM workflows and the ticketing. So why not help them have richer context to what they're providing? Why not help them by giving them the information about the network so that they can use it for their purposes, even though you remain in control of what actually is in the network?
Well, the question becomes at what level of detail, where we have different technical expertise, different knowledge domains that we occupy. So how much information are we sharing, or maybe in what way are we sharing information about the network with these other teams?
Yeah, I'll give you a business school answer. It depends.
Right? That was an engineering
it
answer.
really just depends on who you're talking to, what that other team does, what they need. And I think, the right way to look at it is, let's find the right altitude of information, the right level of abstraction. Like, you're not probably going to give the finance guy the configuration data for a router. They don't care about that, but they want to know other things about that router and what it's connected to, or they want to know end-of-life
My
information.
SecOps team might care about that.
That's right. So you should be able to give different altitudes of information, different types of information to different teams, right? Depending on what their needs are. But then you're a real positive player in the overall business ecosystem for your company. And that too, back to your other point, how do you get management to want this type of way of doing things, this network automation practices? By helping all these other teams do their job, you become a really important cog in the overall enterprise wheel.
Chris, a question for you related to this. I'm building a network operations related workflow to deliver some kind of a service, but that service doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's going to integrate with security and other IT technology silos, perhaps. Do we get to a point where we are delivering a service that is integrated with the delivery of security that's a part of that service? So I'm weaving in things that traditionally I might have not have been worried about as a network engineer, but now I can be, because I've got more programmatic flexibility and workflow automation and so on.
So integration, yes. Tight coupling, no, if I can say it that way. So I think a lot of people hear integration, we start thinking about tying a lot of things together, which kind of slows down the whole mechanism. So I think we have to understand how we work with teams in the more abstract, in the sense that, are we producers, consumers? Are you making your infrastructure programmable? Am I making my infrastructure programmable? Do I call you? Do you call me? I think those details are critically important versus one team programming somebody else's stuff. So I think how these teams work together is probably
There's still a divide on some level.
A lot of my comments come back to kind of how we operate, and I think fundamentally we don't think through that as much as, I have a project to deliver service, or we're moving SD-WAN, or I have a new POP, and we're rushing to do that. But it's like, how do we operate at scale with appropriate decoupling so we can all move fast? I just think velocity is, maybe behind security, velocity and how we operate is probably the most important factor when we think about how we do these teams, because we've always been isolated and siloed for probably good reasons. But as we think about, we start off with talking about config. Config is task related. Config is typically domain focused. When we talk about services and orchestration and operations, that's typically, we start talking horizontally. So we have to have these teams work together, but we have to figure out how to do it efficiently. And I think we've all seen examples where it works wonderfully, and others where those silos kind of are recreated at the service layer, which, I open up 5 tickets to get my service delivered, which was not the intent.
Okay, 2 more topics, guys, and we're running short on time, but these are important. Telemetry and metrics. Let's start with the telemetry. So I need to know from the network that the service I've delivered is working well. We talked about intent. Is my service existing as I intended? But then there's also just the general health of the service and so on. If I've been doing it historically, the way I've been doing it historically, I'm using CCNP polling and so on to see network health. I see circuits and devices and interfaces and so on. But how do I change how I'm consuming telemetry to understand the health of an overall service?
I think you have to take a holistic view to it, right? I mean, CCNP polling is going to give you some of the information you mentioned, but if you really want to get down to the layer of detail of like, what is the traffic composition on that link, right? You're going to need some sort of flow, S-flow, NetFlow, IPFix, some sort of protocol like that that's going to get you the next layer of detail. You're going to need logs, right? You're going to need to know what went wrong. I mean, you need I'll say all of the telemetry. I know that seems like a little bit of a cop-out answer, but you can't just rely on one protocol to understand how the network is operating and how it's performing, and whether the service that you're trying to automate has actually done what you thought it did. And I think, kind of the conversation that Chris was just having about siloed teams, you can't have siloed collection of that data either. They either have to work together to where there's a programmable interface between them so that you can, correlate the data, or you need it all in the same, for lack of a better term, a data lake, or you're going to have to, in these days, run AI on top of it that can look at, logs in your log collection platform, metrics in your metrics collection platform, flow in your flow collection platform, and be able to see, okay, at the same time this traffic pattern changed, I had a spike in CPU and I had a log message that told me my VGP session went down, right? So that you can more quickly get to root cause. You're gonna have to have all that data at least being able to be collected, whether it's AI doing the front end of it or a human doing it.
Well, one big thing is we need to be able to deal with a large volume of telemetry, perhaps.
And it's only getting bigger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bill, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've called out what is and what should be. That's kind of static, right?
Right.
I think what the telemetry does is it lets you know how well your plan is operating, right, in the network, so that you can make adjustments to your intended state of the network. So I don't have a lot of things to say about the type of telemetry, but seeing real world actionable data coming in, how is your network performing, informs how you then plan for the next iteration of your network.
All right, closing question, guys. How do I measure success? That's the metric, the key metric, I think, for all of this. How do I know that my network service automation is working well? Chris, you got thoughts on this?
Tough one. Yeah, that's the easy one, right? I mean, if we're thinking about changing how we operate, it really comes down to how many changes in our infrastructure are, on purpose and driven through the processes we're talking about. We talked about the business outcomes, but as far as like OKRs and KPIs within our teams, I think it's how much stuff we do, how fast we do it, and how efficiently we do it, and that's going to translate into mostly.
Well, then is our ability to deliver services is a metric?
For sure. I think, if you think about your network as, especially for the people in this room, one of the most important assets of our business, we think about the investment in that. Every time we change our infrastructure, there's business value created, or we wouldn't do it, whether it's maintenance, software upgrades, or service provisioning more actively. So I argue the more times we change our infrastructure, the more value creation we are creating for the business. So, because we don't do these things for no reason. Typically, we don't do them for no reason. So I think measuring what we do, how we do it, and how effectively we do it is the core value that can be translated to everybody.
Okay.
Some of it very critical, like a customer gets self-serve provisioning, and other things we're doing maintenance or implementing security, so we run a more risk-free, tolerant network. But every change is important, and I think measuring change effectiveness, and time to value are the critical components.
Justin?
I would say it has to tie back to the business outcomes, though, right? I agree with everything Chris said, but those whatever KPIs we as a networking team are going to measure our changes on, how effective they were, how many we did, needs to tie back to the key business KPIs. And I'm going to assume for most businesses that is SLAs, network uptime, service uptime, those type of things, right? That is really the ultimate outcome of any type of, automating or orchestrating or operating a network.
Parting thought, Bill?
Yeah, there are two levels, and I think we've talked a lot about the levels that the network automation team needs to measure for itself, but I want to just bring it back to also then tying it into the executive level business value. How much faster are you rolling out that new project? How much faster are you able to get the new data center online? How much more effective, how much more cost efficient? How many manual changes are being made, and tie that into the amount of risk that the business is taking when you make a field level change that wasn't immediately approved and don't have a way of remediating it. So I think if you can tie it again to that executive level business value, that's equally as important as all the day-to-day metrics that you need to have as KPIs for your team.
Okay. Okay, let's give our panelists a hand. And Nanog, whoever our handler is, do we have time for questions? We do not have time for questions. Okay.
Always track.
Yep.
All right.